Thank you so much for coming here tonight to think with me about a subject that I think everybody who cares about universities and hopes that they have a good institutional future would agree is very important. I think we all remember that in the weeks and months that followed the Hamas terrorist attack in 2023, there were various university communities that became so inflamed and so hostile that basic social order broke down. Disruptive forms of political expression, including occupation of courtyards and buildings, made it hard for students to hear lectures, sleep in dorm rooms, study in libraries, or use common spaces for the ordinary activities of community life. Worse, many Jewish and Palestinian students reported that they were personally targeted by vicious and sometimes threatening speech and conduct that made them afraid to remain on campus. Civility is a slippery concept. We don't all agree on what it means or even about how important it is relative to other values. But most of us can probably agree that it was missing in action at universities that year. University presidents and opinion columnists and senior statesmen from Mitt Romney to Barack Obama called for a return to civil debate. But what exactly is civil debate? And how far back would we have to turn back the clock to see it in our universities? Was it ever there? Or is this just a sort of fantasy about what universities should be like? University leaders are working hard to answer this question because higher education now faces a political crisis, made possible in part by waning public confidence in our institutions. According to a poll that Pew Research Center released last week, 70% of Americans now think that higher education in America is going in the wrong direction. While recent events accelerated this trend, they did not start it. 60% of Americans gave the same answer to Pew in 2018. Most Americans now think that universities provide too little educational value in return for high tuition fees, and nearly half of Americans think that they are politically captured. So to preserve their independence, I think universities must work to restore public confidence. I think they should do so by recommitting to institutional missions that students and taxpayers can endorse as good use of money, and by enacting policies to advance these missions. On a hopeful note, I sincerely think that many university presidents, deans, and governing board members understand that their institutions are not perfect and are working hard to improve them. I hope to help these reformers by offering a new way of thinking about how the policies they adopt can bring them closer to or further from their institutional ideals. My starting place is a brilliant work of intellectual history and political theory by Professor Teresa Bejan of Oxford University. In her book called Mere Civility, Disagreement and the Limits of Toleration, Bejan traces the development of three different conceptions of civility in the writings of three important 17th century political thinkers, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and a less well-known Puritan missionary and theologian named Roger Williams, who founded the American colony of Rhode Island. Bejan's search shows that each of these thinkers saw civility standards as tools for managing the tensions created by three basic features of their political communities. First, the diversity of its members, especially when it comes to their beliefs about sensitive questions involving religion and politics. Second, the debates that would occur within the community about these different beliefs. And third, political stability, or perhaps more aspirationally, social cohesion. Thomas Hobbes saw the breakdown of social order during the religiously motivated English Civil War. Maybe that was why he was convinced that open debate on subjects as close to the heart as religion and politics was incompatible with civil peace. Hobbes endorsed what Teresa Bejan refers to as a doctrine of civil silence. The proper thing to do when you hear an opinion you disagree with, according to Hobbes, was to bite your tongue, because human beings are very offended by any expression of disagreement, no matter how gently it is put. In fact, Even silence can be offensive if it implies that disagreement is being concealed. In such cases, Hobbes argued it was best to lie. Now, a system like this works best if people know in advance which opinions they can coordinate on. And so Hobbes thought that the government had authority to promulgate official orthodoxies on controversial questions and punish dissent. As repressive as that sounds, Hobbes's view was compatible with a very, very limited toleration for diversity. Like Queen Elizabeth I, he did not seek to make windows into men's souls. As long as you kept your unorthodox opinions strictly to yourself, you were free to have them. Even minority religious services could be discreetly held so long as their participants did not evangelize their beliefs. Locke's version of civility was much more aspirational, and Bejan refers to it as civil charity, where Hobbes felt that any debate posed unacceptable risks. Locke thought the right sort of civility standard could make disagreements safe. In fact, he even hoped that civility could restore a satisfying degree of social cohesion to post-Reformation England by providing a new set of common civic values centered on sincere mutual respect and affection between citizens. People inculcated in the norm of civil charity would love and respect each other despite their religious differences. As a result, they would disagree about sensitive topics in a tone of heartfelt humanity and goodwill, and would never resort to contempt or condemnation. Now, in most ways, Locke's civil charity was more tolerant than Hobbes's civil silence. After all, Locke condemned state censorship on substantive religious questions. But principle and practice are two different things. And Teresa Bejan argues that Locke's civil charity was more exclusionary in practice than it first appeared to be. While Hobbes was content to require only external compliance with orthodoxy, Locke's civil charity required a genuine commitment to shared values of mutual respect and affection. A government that aimed to inculcate sincere like-mindedness among citizens might resort to intrusive measures to ensure that citizens have the right sorts of thoughts and feelings. For example, Locke suggested that magistrates focus on improving the manners of religious dissenters and promoted state-sponsored moral education for working-class children. Hobbes's civil silence and Locke's civil charity are opposites in many ways, but Bejan persuasively portrays them as competing proposals for navigating tensions between those three key social features we discussed earlier: diversity, debate, and social stability or cohesion. Hobbes regarded diversity as a regrettable but unavoidable fact of life, and he sought to preserve stability by sacrificing debate. Locke, on the other hand, sought to make debate compatible with a high level of social cohesion that his approach required citizens to sincerely commit to a set of shared civic values. Bejan argues that to be successful, Locke's approach would have required a substantial reduction in the diversity of belief that existed in 17th century England. With that in mind, let's turn to Roger Williams, a man who seems to have strikingly little in common with either Hobbes or Locke. Hobbes and Locke both spent their adult lives in elite European social circles. Williams spent most of his in tiny, economically insecure, and politically fragile American colonies. Bejan portrays him as a firebrand and a scold. He criticized colonial leaders for insufficient moral rectitude, described Catholicism as a kind of devil worship, and warned everyone from Native Americans to members of competing Protestant sects that they were probably going to hell. You might think that a man like Williams would not have much interest in civility. And it's true that the Hobbesian and Lockean flavors of civility would not have attracted him. As a devout evangelical dissident, Williams could never have endorsed or even complied with Hobbesian civil silence. He believed that he had a moral duty to save souls by converting people to the true faith. As a governor of Rhode Island, populated by a motley collection of different dissident groups and surrounded by Native American tribes, he would have had no use for so utopian a project as Lockean civil charity. But Williams faced a supercharged version of the exact same problem: an exceptionally diverse colony comprised of people who loved to argue with each other and with their native neighbors. He also had few military or economic resources to enforce basic order, much less nurture social cohesion. Williams needed some theory of civility to mitigate these tensions and keep his community functioning. But censorship was not an option. For Williams, freedom of religion necessarily included the freedom to evangelize, including the freedom to argue, to criticize, and even to condemn. Nor did he want to exclude uncivil people from his colony. If anything, their souls were in most need of saving. So Williams settled on a radical policy, extremely broad religious tolerance accompanied by virtually unfettered speech. To preserve social order, he insisted only on what Bejan calls mere civility, adherence to superficial social customs of the type that make daily interactions possible. He had in mind the kinds of things we expect small children to learn, like waiting in line, using conventional forms of address, using words like please and thank you, and practices like doffing hats and kissing hello. It was not necessary to follow these customs out of sincere love or respect for your neighbors. In fact, the whole point of mere civility was to make peaceful coexistence possible, even between people who despised each other. Unlike Hobbes or Locke, Williams was determined to combine a lot of diversity with a lot of debate. In return, he was willing to give up on aspirational levels of social cohesion, and he sought to establish the least demanding civility standards that he could to keep the peace in his colony. You might be wondering at this point why I think university policymakers should be paying attention to these 17th century ideas. I think they should pay attention because they are struggling with the same basic tension between diversity, debate, and social cohesion that Hobbes, Locke, and Williams struggled with centuries ago. I think the timeless insight that emerges from Bejan's analysis is that no community can be all things to all people. In reality, all community leaders are facing painful trade-offs between diversity, debate, and cohesion. And when we start to talk about civility, we are really talking about the balance we think should be struck between these three values in a given community. If anyone doubts that universities are facing a version of the same challenge, those doubts should be laid to rest by undertaking a simple mental exercise. When I sat down and thought about it, I realized that the complaints that people tend to make about failures of civility or about the failures of civility policies on campus can easily be restated in terms of a lack of one of those same three key community features. For example, evidence showing that very few professors have conservative, populist, or traditional religious beliefs, and that opinion among students attending elite institutions is similarly unrepresentative, can be described as a lack of diversity. Speech codes, deplatformings, and dismissals of dissident faculty can be described as a lack of debate. And of course, vandalism, doxing, harassment, trespass, and the like can be described as a lack of social order. So I think this framework should help university leaders to think more rigorously about how they got themselves into this pickle. My own view is that most universities have been in denial about the inescapable trade-offs that exist between these three features. So instead of deciding what their institutional priorities were, they tried to have it all. For decades, universities have worked hard to ensure that their campus communities are diverse, along lines including race, ethnicity, sex, national origin, religious affiliation, disability status, rural versus urban background, and special interests like sports or artistic pursuits. These universities also promise to be centers of robust debate on important social and political questions. Finally, universities present themselves to prospective students as highly socially cohesive, as respectful, supportive, and affectionate communities where students will feel a deep sense of belonging and spend some of their happiest years. So universities wanted to host robust debates between highly diverse students and faculty who would all love and respect one another after they had aired their deep disagreements. Naturally, universities tried to cut this Gordian knot using Locke's strategy. They tried to establish a relatively thin foundation of universally shared community values, like mutual respect and inclusion, that would generate ground rules for debate and make it compatible with social cohesion. At first, this seemed like a plausible strategy. After all, almost anyone you ask will tell you that of course they respect the equal moral value of every person, and of course they want to be kind to their peers. But the problem arises when we try to decide what those values imply about specific controversial moral and political questions, and how we can permissibly talk about them. After all, there are many people who sincerely believe that the principles of equal respect and inclusion directly, logically entail that trans women are women, that unauthorized immigration cannot be blameworthy since no person is illegal, and that abortion is a human right. Or, alternatively, that abortion is murder, or that racial preferences in hiring and admissions are always wrong. Now, I don't think any of those conclusions are straightforward, logical implications of the highly general principles of equal respect and inclusion, but many students do, which led them to complain that people who argued against claims of this type were violating their university's ground rules for debate. In the face of these complaints, universities decided, just as Locke did, that they could resolve the problem with educational efforts to ensure that the community's foundational values were universally understood and affirmed. I'm referring, of course, to the proliferation of DEI trainings, speech codes, and gently reforming magistrates, whose mission is to provide students and faculty with more specific guidance about what equal respect and inclusion is supposed to look like in actual practice. Once this apparatus was up and running, though, it became clear that the Lockean strategy was a slippery slope towards a moving target. Instead of fostering productive debate, universities wound up imposing a Hobbesian civil silence by construing the values of mutual respect and inclusion in ways that yielded orthodox answers to many of our most pressing moral and political questions. Students and faculty who disagreed with these orthodoxies could be tolerated on campus so long as they kept their heterodox opinions to themselves. If you're feeling doubtful, consider this example. A friend of mine who teaches at one of America's most prestigious and selective universities was reported to a DEI officer because he had walked his students through the steps of an argument against gay marriage. It's worth noting that he told the students at the time that he personally was in favor of gay marriage. But at the restorative justice meeting that the DEI officer organized, in which my friend was expected to and did apologize to the offended students, those students told him that it had been disrespectful to make them listen to an argument against gay marriage, even though my friend had told them at the time that he disagreed with the argument. And my friend suffered no long-term career repercussions as a result of the incident, but a process like this one is highly effective at training professors not to say the things that they are not supposed to say. And I don't think that my friend has walked anyone through the steps of an argument against gay marriage since then. Instead, he is among the 40% of faculty who worry that their reputations could be damaged because something they say or do will be misunderstood, according to a 2024 survey by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Nor does this chilling effect extend only to faculty. I remember making a mistake once when I was leading an undergraduate student seminar and a controversial social issue came up. I looked at a student in the class who'd been rather quiet, and I said, "What do you think?" He turned a little pale and said, "Do I have to tell you?" "No, of course not," I apologized. But he kept looking at me, and then he softly said, "Well, I'm Muslim, so..." And then he trailed off and allowed me to finish his answer in the privacy of my own head. Since then, I have wondered how common a situation that might be. A 2024 survey by the Knight Foundation found that 60% of US college students thought the climate on their campus prevented some people from saying things that they believe. And yet, I have not seen any university reassure its Muslim students that they are free to defend traditional perspectives on gender, sex, or marriage when the topics come up in classrooms. I wonder whether universities should congratulate themselves about including religious minority students if it turns out that many of those students think they must hide their beliefs. If I am correct so far, if it's more or less the case that universities got overly ambitious and tried to maximize diversity, debate, and social cohesion all at once, and if it's also true that their optimistic Lockean effort to establish a thin foundation of shared community values backfired in a way that led to Hobbesian civil silence, then we shouldn't be surprised by the sudden breakdown of social order that we all witnessed in 2023 and 2024. Hobbesian civil silence was working pretty well with respect to issues about which opinion on university campuses was already lopsided and on which a campus orthodoxy had been established over time. The Hamas terrorist attack and Israel's military response destabilized these arrangements by suddenly increasing the salience of an issue about which campus opinion was much more equally divided, and therefore about which university administrators had hoped no orthodoxy would be required. We should not be surprised that university leaders were besieged on all sides by demands that they prescribe what would be orthodox about the conflict in the Middle East. After all, Hobbesian civil silence had been universities' de facto strategy for protecting the social order from the destabilizing effects of disagreement for years, and students had grown to expect it. But on this subject, university leadership was incapable of agreeing to adopt an official party line. The only viable course is to rediscover the virtues of institutional neutrality. But to students, and perhaps to many faculty as well, this looked like a sudden abandonment of moral responsibility, and not a little rage was directed at university leaders themselves. So, where do universities go from here? I think the first step is to frankly acknowledge that they cannot simultaneously be all things to all people. There are real trade-offs between the diversity of a community's beliefs, the extent to which the community debates sensitive moral and political questions, and the social cohesion of that community. Once this bitter pill has been swallowed, universities will see that they have some options. One option has always been with us, and that is to accept less intellectual diversity in order to maintain a highly cohesive community defined by common values. Many excellent religious universities have taken this approach. For example, the mission of Brigham Young University is to assist individuals in their quest for perfection and eternal life. Its students rigorously study academic subjects in the light of divine truth. And both students and faculty adhere to strict rules of conduct that prohibit drinking, smoking, extramarital sex, and contradicting or opposing rather than analyzing or discussing fundamental church doctrine or policy. BYU is not, and it does not try to be, a university for everyone. I, for example, am too fond of coffee and wine and questioning conventional wisdom to be a good fit. But an established orthodoxy on moral and religious matters has not prevented BYU from producing groundbreaking research in fields like engineering, nanotechnology, and life sciences, as well as leading works in philosophy and theology that are consistent with the university's core commitments. Moreover, a BYU education provides students with the knowledge and skills necessary to succeed in competitive secular graduate schools at high rates. It would not be unthinkable for some of America's secular private universities to try something similar. Private institutions have a constitutional right to freedom of association under the First Amendment that would enable them to legally establish ideological criteria in hiring and admissions, and would probably prevent the federal government from denying them equal access to federal programs. It would be one way out of the current crisis for a few institutions. But I would be sorry to see this approach come to dominate higher education. Like Roger Williams, I see value in robust discussions about controversies of great import, even when those discussions are less than comfortable. I think the most promising path forward for most universities will combine a laser-like focus on its traditional research and teaching functions, a renewed commitment to freedom of speech and debate, and somewhat more modest expectations for social cohesion. In other words, I think many universities would benefit from giving mere civility a try. Institutional insiders know that mere civility is already the established norm in certain domains of university life, like faculty meetings. It is not rare for relations between long-tenured colleagues to ripen over time into stable, well-understood bonds of mutual contempt. Look, I'm not saying that we should not each strive to sincerely love and respect our peers, no matter how disagreeable we find them. Of course we should. I think each of us has a personal moral duty to strive for this. But the bureaucratic apparatus designed to unite hearts and minds has been self-defeating. I suspect that working relationships amongst colleagues and students on many campuses would benefit from more relaxed expectations. And mere civility is not the same thing as chaos or anarchy. Roger Williams was an unusually permissive colonial leader, but even he had his limits. And it will be useful to examine those limits in a bit more detail. Teresa Bejan reports that of all the diverse groups that gravitated to the Rhode Island colony over the years, the one that caused him the most worry was the Quakers. Now, this surprised me when I read it because I know some Quakers and they're incredibly laid back, pleasant people to be around. But Bejan explains that these 17th century Quakers were religious revolutionaries. They thought they were duty-bound to disrupt the daily lives of others for the moral improvement of their peers. Not only did Quakers refuse to doff hats and kiss hello according to common custom, they were also known to walk naked on public streets to call attention to ungodly behavior, which also seems like a violation of one of those simple social rules that Williams believed in. But perhaps more importantly, they would interfere in various ways with the religious expression of others. For example, they were known to interrupt other people's church services by banging on pots and pans and shouting down the minister. Bejan even describes one case in which a colonial Quaker removed his trousers and laid down on a church communion table during the service. Finally, they would reportedly shut down the kinds of religious debates that Williams believed were so important by suddenly falling into prayer as a means of silencing a competing speaker. Given the importance that Williams ascribed to freedom of speech in religious matters, it should not surprise us that the group he considered the most uncivil was one that tended to interfere with the religious expression of others. I think the lesson for 21st century universities is that freedom of expression on campus needs to be a reciprocal affair. To paraphrase Immanuel Kant, my favorite early modern philosopher, each student should have the greatest freedom compatible with the like freedom of others. A university committed to a policy of mere civility would have and enforce neutral rules that afford equal opportunities for student expression on campus and protect the rights of students and faculty to engage in the structured expressive activities essential to teaching and research. This part is really just common sense, but it's much easier to propose common sense than it is to actually achieve it in a social context in which many people believe that they are morally justified in their efforts to disrupt the social order that makes daily community life possible. I suspect that universities will find this task easier if students arrive on campus with more realistic expectations about the moral and political disagreements they are likely to have with their peers and with university leadership. Implementing mere civility would make a university less like a pressure cooker and more like a tea kettle. After the explosive events of the last couple of years, I think many students and faculty would welcome the shrill but stable whistle of open disagreement on campus. Thank you.